Brian lived in a nondescript apartment building in the heart of the city. To most, the building looked like just another brick-and-mortar block blending into the urban chaos. But Brian relished its anonymity. It gave him cover. It allowed him to observe without attracting suspicion. He kept to himself, always polite but distant. To the neighbors who passed him in the hall, he was that quiet guy in 3B. He was the sort of person you wouldn't think about after walking past. Invisible. And Brian liked it that way. But behind the door of 3B, Brian had a world all his own. He spent his evenings in front of a large corkboard he'd mounted on his living room wall, covered with snapshots, scraps of newspaper, and handwritten notes connected by a tangled web of red string. His neighbors were the unwilling stars of his personal project. Each photo pinned to the board was taken without their knowledge. A man walking his dog at the park. A young woman seated in her car, scrolling on her phone. A couple arguing in their kitchen, caught through half-open blinds. All of them had one thing in common. They didn't know Brian was watching. For years, Brian had been content to simply observe. The faces on the board made him feel powerful, like a puppeteer holding unseen strings. But lately, it wasn't enough. The images weren't satisfying anymore. He wanted to interact, to touch the other, lives surrounding him, to show them one by one that he was in control. The first incident was minor. The man from 1A, Mr. Connolly, always left his apartment at 8 a.m. sharp to pick up coffee at the corner shop. One morning as he walked out, he found his cup of coffee, already waiting on the doorstep of his apartment. It was from the coffee shop he frequented, prepared exactly the way he always ordered it. Pleased, but slightly unnerved, he glanced around the empty hallway, then took the cup. Brian watched from the peephole of 3B, heart hammering. Just the expression on Connolly's face gave him a rush. Confusion, unease, even a hint of fear. It was intoxicating. From then on, Brian's tricks escalated. Small things at first. Moving the potted plants outside Mrs. Delgado's door in different arrangements. Slipping an unsigned birthday card under Emily from 2C's door on a date she hadn't told anyone was her birthday. Leaving a single soiled work boot on the landing where the mail carrier always stopped. For weeks, the tenants buzzed with theories. "Weird things are happening around here," said Mrs. Delgado at one tenant meeting, wringing her hands. "Whoever it is has too much time on their hands." Brian sat quietly at the back of the room, nodding along like everyone else. But the more they wondered and worried, the more his satisfaction faded. Their fear was exciting, but Brian craved something escalating, something permanent. His mind churned with dark possibilities. That's when he began to fixate on Lindsey from 4F. Lindsey was a night shift nurse, often walking into the building in her white scrubs just before dawn. She was in her late 20s, with chestnut hair. She kept tied in a bun, and a few freckles on her pale cheeks. She had an easy smile and always greeted the neighbors, even Brian. She became his favorite to watch. Through her blinds, he saw her sit cross-legged on the couch, eating cereal while watching late-night talk shows. He saw her press her temple against her hand while reading texts, her expression growing distant. She hummed to herself in the kitchen, sometimes laughing at nothing in particular. Brian saw everything. One night, while the city hummed quietly in the rain, Brian decided to enter Lindsey's apartment. He'd been watching long enough to know her habits. She would be gone until sunrise. He stood outside her door at 3 a.m., picking the lock with unsettling ease. The door creaked open, and he stepped inside, immediately hit by the scent of lilies from a vase on the table. He stayed for an hour. He didn't steal anything. He didn't need to. The thrill came from inhabiting her world, standing where she stood, touching the things she touched. He ran his fingers along the back of the chair she always sat in, rested a hand on her bedspread, flipped through her notebook and read half-finished thoughts in her looping handwriting. He even carved his initials into the sole of her favorite sneakers, tucked by the door. A secret, waiting to be found. But before he left, a thought struck him. Something bolder. He twisted a strand of hair from the brush on her dresser, slid. it into a small plastic bag, and pocketed it. Souvenirs. When Lindsey returned the next morning, she immediately felt like something was off. Nothing was missing. Nothing was obviously out of place. But as she sat on her couch, staring at her window, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. She began locking her doors religiously. She checked her closets at night. She didn't know Brian had already memorized the soft tremor in her hands when they passed in the hall. Brian didn't stop. He left a single daisy on her doormat once, knowing it was her favorite flower. He called her phone from blocked numbers, only to listen to her say hello. He even slipped into her apartment a second time one night, while she slept, just to watch her breathe. But Lindsey was sharp. She'd started to notice the oddities. The way her framed photo on her desk tilted slightly when she knew she hadn't touched it. The faint, unfamiliar scent lingering in the air after she woke up. Soon, she logged into the tenant chat group to voice her growing paranoia. That's when Brian made his fatal mistake. The building had installed a new security system weeks prior after a string of burglaries. Brian, slipping out of Lindsey's apartment that night, hadn't realized the hallway camera had just been activated. The next day, a concerned neighbor reviewing the footage saw him. He wasn't invisible anymore. The police banged on the door of 3B the following week. Inside, they found the corkboard of photos, strands of hair in neatly labeled Ziploc bags, and a collection of Lindsey's items, from old receipts to a mug she thought she'd misplaced weeks ago. Brian was silent as they cuffed him, his pale lips twitching into a faint smile. His face dominated the news for days, the footage from the hallway plastered on every screen in town. "I just wanted them to notice me," Brian said in his first police interview, his voice low but calm. "I wanted to connect." When a journalist asked him if he regretted it, his smile widened. "They'll never forget me now." To this day, tenants of the old apartment building still talk about the man in 3B, his face haunting them whenever they hear their own doors creak open in the night. Because some of them wonder, what if he comes back? After Brian was arrested, the police ensured that his belongings were thoroughly catalogued and moved into evidence. Among the items were photographs of nearly every tenant in the building, scraps of journal entries that suggested he'd been keeping meticulous notes on daily routines, and a chilling sketch of Lindsey asleep in her bed. The discovery made the news cycle for weeks, and residents of the apartment building were divided between fury and fear. Some simply wanted to forget, while others couldn't shake the dread that lingered long after Brian's face vanished from their TV screens. But for Lindsey, it wasn't over. At first, she thought she could return to some semblance of normalcy. Neighbors offered condolences, and strangers in the street recognized her as the survivor of a now infamous stalking case. People called her brave. She wasn't sure they were right. Sleep became a luxury she couldn't afford. Every creak of her old apartment seemed amplified, and even the sound of footsteps in the hall sent a shock of adrenaline through her. Any face in the crowd could belong to someone else like Brian, someone worse. It got worse when she started receiving letters. The first one arrived just 4 days after Brian was transferred to a high-security psychiatric facility, pending psychiatric evaluations. It was a plain white envelope, nothing handwritten to mark who sent it. But inside was a single sheet of unlined paper with the words typed in bold. "I'll see you again, Lindsey. Maybe sooner than you think." She froze. Sweat broke out along her spine as her vision tracked the words over and over, hoping to find some clue in the letter that it wasn't what it seemed. But the message was clear enough. She immediately contacted the police, who assured her the mail was being looked into. Brian wouldn't have access to mail, the officer said, though his voice carried an edge of uncertainty that Lindsey picked up on. Still, the letters kept coming. Some were as short as the first. Others rambled about the details of things she thought only she would know, things Brian could not possibly have seen. One mentioned the lavender-scented soap she'd started using only after his arrest. Another spoke of the book she was reading before bed that week, down to the exact page she was on. With every letter, her world shrank, her isolation growing as paranoia took hold. The police doubled their surveillance of Brian within the facility. Despite being confined, he seemed content, even amused. Officers reported that Brian often smiled during interrogations, staring at them until they grew unnerved, volunteering no information unless asked. When one detective finally asked how the letters were being sent, Brian chuckled. "Do you really think I'm working alone?" he asked, tilting his head like he had asked a simple riddle. The detective's stomach turned. "Who else is involved?" Brian leaned in. "You think I was invisible? There are more of us. You've seen one face, but we all have others." The interview ended abruptly as Brian began to laugh, a low, rasping sound that grew louder until the walls of the interrogation room felt too close. Meanwhile, back at the apartment building, strange occurrences began to unsettle the remaining tenants. Some claimed to hear footsteps in the halls at odd hours, but no one was there when they looked. Others swore their doors had been opened and shut while they slept, though their locks were still intact. Mrs. Delgado even claimed she saw Brian standing outside her window one night, staring up at her from the street. The neighbors wrote it off as hysteria, a trick of light, or the stress they were all still grappling with, except for Lindsey. She believed Mrs. Delgado because she'd also started seeing things Brian couldn't physically have done. One morning, as she prepared for work, she noticed something new on her bathroom mirror. Written in the misty residue of her last shower were 3 words, "Miss me yet?" Her hands trembled as she forced herself to wipe the mirror clean, but the words stayed burned in her memory. When the building's landlord decided to change the locks on all apartments and install a new surveillance system, it gave some tenants a sense of relief, but not for long. A week later, video footage showed something chilling. A figure wearing a black hoodie and a baseball cap was seen walking the halls late at night. The footage cut out for nearly 5 minutes before returning, with the figure no longer in sight. No one could say who it was, and the camera's system had no record of the footage before or after the blackout. The landlord vowed to improve the system, but Lindsey couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She began waking up to the faint smell of lilies in her apartment, a scent she hadn't had since someone had gifted her a bouquet weeks prior. When her friend suggested she move out, she resisted, for reasons she couldn't even explain, and then it all came to a head. One gray afternoon, Lindsey received a package. Unlike the letters, this one had no return address and was much larger than her usual mail. Cautiously, she opened it to reveal a single item wrapped in layers of packing paper. It was an ornate, antique corkboard, almost identical to the one the police had taken from Brian's apartment. Pinned to it were fresh Polaroids. Lindsey froze as she examined each one. They weren't of her, but of the building, the lobby, her door, her bedroom window. The most recent photo sent a dagger through her chest. It was taken from inside her living room. It showed her sitting on the couch, clutching a cup of tea just the night before. Before she could fully process the horror, her phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. It read, "Told you, Lindsey. I'm closer than you think. 2 weeks." Later, Brian disappeared from custody without a trace. Security cameras caught no sign of anyone entering or leaving during the shift when he vanished. His guards claimed they'd only looked away for a moment, and when their backs turned, his cell was empty. Records indicated that the staff and other patients all reported hearing faint laughter echoing through the building that night. The letters to Lindsey stopped abruptly after that. The mysterious figure in the apartment halls was never seen again, and things seemed normal for a while. But Lindsey never truly felt safe. She changed her address, her job, even her name. And yet, every now and then, she hears a faint, familiar rhythm of laughter in her dreams, or a creak of a door that shouldn't be open. Sometimes, when the air goes still, she swears she smells lilies, and in those quiet moments, she knows Brian is still out there, watching, waiting for the right time to come back. Lindsey knew running wasn't an option anymore. Changing her name, moving towns, leaving behind everything familiar, that wasn't a life. It was hiding. And if Brian had proven anything, it was that hiding wouldn't keep her safe. No matter where she went, he'd find her. But the unanswered question gnawed away at her sanity as much as the fear did. Why me? What had she done to Brian to deserve this fixation? What about her had triggered the quiet storm of his obsession? She didn't know, and she couldn't move forward until she did. Her nightmares spilled into her waking life more often now, and there were moments when she swore Brian was right there, standing just outside her line of sight. That faint smell of lilies came and went, and she was starting to wonder if it was real or if Brian had driven her to the edge. But Lindsey was done being afraid. It wouldn't end, not unless she ended it herself. The months following Brian's escape hadn't just been filled with his haunting presence. They were also months of preparation. At her core, Lindsey had always been practical and resourceful. A nurse needed to stay calm in emergencies, and that same instinct carried her now as she created a plan. She started small but deliberate. Self-defense. Classes were her first step. She didn't tell anyone why she wanted to learn how to fight back. The instructor thought she was just another woman taking precautions in a dangerous world. Lindsey kept attending until her punches grew stronger, until she could flip a man twice her size with a single fluid movement. But it wasn't just about strength. It was about avoiding her own worst fear. That if Brian came for her again, she'd freeze like before. She'd collapse under the weight of her terror. Not anymore. Then she started hunting for answers. Lindsey woke early and created routines for herself, searching for cracks in Brian's history. She quietly hired a private investigator, something she could barely afford, but when he handed her another stack of documents weeks later, she felt a small ember of hope. Brian had grown up just a state away, raised in near-complete isolation, by a mother with a deep distrust of the outside world. The PI tracked down old family records, even discovering an uncle who remembered Brian as a cold, unsettling child. He liked to follow people and draw pictures of them without saying a word, the man explained over the phone. The things he used to draw, they weren't right. Made your stomach twist just looking at them. Lindsey didn't sleep that night. The last document in the pile was an address for a property once owned by Brian's family. A ranch-style house deep in the woods, left abandoned after his mother's death. The thought of going there alone made her skin crawl, but Lindsey reminded herself of the self-defense classes, of the fact that no one else could stop this. And so, one quiet morning, she packed a flashlight, a knife, and a pocket full of courage and drove out to the woods. The air by the old house was thick, stagnant, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. The property was decaying, the roof warped from weather, and the front door slightly ajar as though inviting her in. Lindsey hesitated, her breath shallow, but she forced one foot in front of the other. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and something sweeter, more sickly: lilies. The living room was bare except for overturned furniture and a filthy mattress in the corner. But what caught her eye was what hung on the walls. Photographs were pinned or taped haphazardly, curling at the edges. They weren't all of her, not yet. Most were photos of other women, caught in candid moments, their unsuspecting smiles captured in grainy stills. Lindsey's stomach lurched as she realized some of these women had been listed as missing on old news reports she'd read after Brian's arrest. And then she saw herself, a newer image. She was walking home from the grocery store, bags tucked under her arm. Lindsey reached out with a trembling hand, ripping the photo from the wall, the paper crumpling in her fist. She scanned the room, but it was empty. She was alone. For now. She reached the bedroom next, her steps slow and deliberate. The air grew thinner, her pulse louder, but she pushed forward. The bed was unmade, the walls scratched with incoherent, words and shapes. But next to the nightstand was something she hadn't expected. A journal. The cover was worn, the items inside scribbled in an erratic, frantic hand. Everything was a mess of ramblings, twisted confessions, and bizarre sketches of eyes and hands gripping at voids. But as she flipped through the pages, she found it. The answer to her question. Why me? Lindsey stared silently at the paragraph scrawled in red ink. It didn't make sense to her, but it made sense to Brian. Lindsey sees me. She smiled at me, not like the others. She looked at me like she understood, like it didn't scare her. Everyone else turns away. They push me out. But not her. She belongs with me. I'll show her. She'll understand soon enough. Her knees threatened to give way as nausea replaced her fear. A single fleeting smile in a hallway. That was all it had taken for Brian to decimate her world. She clutched the journal tighter, her determination solidifying, even as fury burned bright. In her chest, she was disturbed to realize a part of what he'd written was true. She did see him now. Not just as some abstract monster, but as something worse. A man utterly consumed by his fractured mind and the need to possess her. She tore out the page and stuffed it into her pocket, ready to leave. But then, from the farthest corner of the bedroom, she heard a creak. Slow, deliberate. Going through my personal things, Lindsey. His voice was smooth, mocking, and it sent icy dread racing up her spine. Brian stepped out of the shadows, his face unchanged since the last time she'd seen him in custody. But something about his eyes was wilder. His smile stretched wide as he took a small step closer. I knew you'd come. You've been trying to understand me, haven't you? I told you. I knew you'd see. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she didn't. Instead, she took a step back, not one of retreat, but of positioning. She slowly slid a hand into her pocket, gripping the handle of the knife as her breathing slowed. You don't scare me anymore, Brian, she said, her voice sharper than she expected. Brian tilted his head, surprised, before his smile twisted into something darker. You should be. And then he lunged,